Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Ask Dave. Now, recently I was trashing Marcus Poschner's horrible recording of Mahler's Second Symphony, and I sat there with my score, pointing out all of the things he does wrong, and someone asked me, do conductors routinely alter the score or change the score or do things to the score in performance? And the answer is, well, yes, they do. They do it all the time. But not just conductors, everybody, every player, everybody who picks up an instrument, everybody who reads notes on a page. They're always modifying what they see on the page, whether because someone tells them to or because they feel impelled to do it based on their own knowledge and training. And that raises a very interesting question, which is, what is the score and how seriously must people pay attention to it? Well, here is a score. Let us describe what it is and what it is not. This is the score of Haydn Symphony Number 53, L'Imperiale. I happen to have it sitting here on my desk with a little round circle where I put my water thing. So we look inside, and there it is, the score. You've got the list of instruments required to play the symphony. You see how they're all arranged. You see lots of notes. You see signs indicating how loud, how soft, what they should be doing with those notes, and what order they should play them. But this is not Haydn Symphony Number 53. It is a recipe. It is a blueprint for Haydn Symphony Number 53, which only exists when all of the people get together and do what's in here. You might think that's an obvious point, and perhaps it is. But it's important to note, because when people say they're being absolutely faithful to the score, that's a warning. That's a warning that something probably isn't right. It's a good thing to do what the composer tells you to do in the score. But normally, that's the minimum. That's where the performance begins, not the fully realized enchilada. Not a bit, because a score, in my way of thinking, comprises vastly more than just the notes on the page and the indications that the composer wrote. First of all, no composer writes down everything. Every composer who ever existed understands that there are certain conventions that performers, the people reading the score, should know. And they don't have to write them down because everybody just knows them. And so knowing what those are is an important element in realizing a score. And of course, depending on what period the music was written, some of that unstated information can comprise more or less of what the performers are supposed to do. Sometimes it can comprise much more than 50% of what the performers are supposed to do. So the score becomes just a very bare outline. But as history and time went on, composers tried to take greater and greater control over what performers did. Composers wanted to leave less and less up to chance. One of the most famous examples of that occurs in Beethoven's Emperor Concerto, where in the first movement, the orchestra pauses, and the soloist normally would improvise a cadenza on the themes of the first movement, a big improvised passage of indeterminate length. And Beethoven, not trusting his interpreters to do it tastefully and appropriately, wrote, "Do not make a cadenza, but proceed immediately with the following." And he writes it all down, thereby eliminating once and for all that last opportunity for the performers to add their own, personal take as part of the score. It's part of the piece. You can't ignore it. And after that, composers tended to indicate more and more and more of what they wanted their players to do. Mahler's scores are famous for being excruciatingly detailed. But even there, there's tons and tons that's left to the whims of the performers. And Mahler himself even said, if after my death something doesn't sound right, change it. He said, you not only have the right, but the obligation to change it. So, composers understand when they write things down that they're not going to get it all. It's just not possible. And when it comes to things for large orchestras like symphonies, where you've got hundreds of people playing at the same time, there's more and more that's left up to the whim of the performer and the conductor, who can't possibly be in control of everything. The most technically adroit conductors in the world, like Laurent Mazel, who were fabulously on top of the score, still left gobs of things to chance, to the whim of the performer, or to simply the circumstances, the acoustics of the room, the talent and quality of the orchestra, whether or not someone had indigestion. It's all up for grabs. So when I sit here and show a score and wave it around and scream and jump up and down, normally what that means is that an interpreter has not done something very basic, something essential to the realization of the music, something that involves what I would call idiomatic interpretation. Knowing how it's supposed to sound and following the basics, just the very basics of what the composer wants. Sometimes that may be a good thing. It depends on the interpretation. It depends on the audible result and how it fits into the wider context of the interpretation. You can't generalize. Each case has to be evaluated on an individual basis, and it has to be based on your knowledge of what the composer wrote and the circumstances in which he wrote it. So the very idea of a score can encompass a much wider fund of musical knowledge, because it isn't just what the composer wrote. It's what was going on when he wrote it. What was he thinking of? What other comments did he make or she make subsequent to writing it that indicate what their intentions were? And how satisfied were they with their intentions? Tchaikovsky is a composer who poses great difficulties for interpreters of his scores because he hated just about everything he wrote as soon as it was done. The Fifth Symphony, it has that famous cut, and there's a famous cut in the finale. You may not know. I mean, they don't do it anymore. But there was a time when everybody took this gigantic cut in the middle of the fifth finale of the fifth, and one of the justifications was that Tchaikovsky supposedly told his brother that it was okay. But more than that, it was Tchaikovsky himself who said, that finale is a failure. There's something artificial. People know it's lousy. It sucks. That's license to kill in musical terms. That means performers can do what they want. And they did. Nowadays, we're a little bit more careful when it comes to making huge structural cuts and things like that in pieces of earlier music. We prefer to hear what the composer wanted to do, by and large, mistakes and all, if that's what they were. But we know what the history was, we know what he thought about it, and so that's part of the score. So is the entire period instrument movement, which alleges that they're going to go back and try and play the music as the composer themselves might have actually heard it on any given day. Of course, this is entirely conjectural. So the value that has is no more valuable than as if none of that scholarship had ever existed, because we can't really know what it sounded like. It's interesting, but is it definitive? No, of course not. It actually belongs in the same category as playing earlier music on more modern instruments, because we know what composers would have wanted had all things been perfect. We know what Bach would have wanted but never got, because he wrote a letter saying this is what we need to have good church music in Leipzig. And so people can either do what he actually had, which sucked and which he was dissatisfied with, and claim that that's somehow better than what he would have wanted, which quite frankly is a lot better. most of the time, all things being equal. All of that is part of the score. So when you look at it in the largest sense, we need to understand that the score is the sum total of knowledge of how a work is supposed to sound. And it comprises, first, the primary evidence, the written notes. Second, the historical evidence surrounding the composer's intentions and performance practice of the period. And then the ideal of what the composer may have wanted. And then the quotidian circumstances of performance on any given day today, what conductors or artists have to work with, and how they can realize all of that stuff under a given set of circumstances. All of that is the score. And so once we understand what the score really is, I think it's really obvious that every performance is an approximation. And our job as listeners, my job as a critic, is to try and assess whether or not that approximation is a valid and legitimate and expressively meaningful and moving embodiment of what the composer intended to express. So I hope this answers your question, and that's the best answer I can give you. That's what makes listening so fascinating. The fact that it isn't just a question of mechanically doing what you see printed in front of you. It's a creative or recreative act. And how much of all of those different elements are able to come together as a satisfying unity in performance, that's what determines how we respond to the piece of music in question. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.